In this video, you are going to install and use your very first third-party React component. This one's called React Modal. It's what's going to allow us to create the nicer looking modal as opposed to the built-in alert dialog. Now, it's great that we already know about the children prop because that is exactly what React Modal does. So not only are we going to be able to use this component, we're going to be able to actually understand how it works behind the scenes. As always, I do want to make you aware of where you can learn more. I'm going to pull up the documentation for that component right now. And if you Google React Modal, you should get to the right place. We're looking for the React Modal repository, which is part of the React.js organization. If we head over there, the only thing we really care about is the documentation, which is the README file you can see down below. And we're just going to take a quick peek at what the code looks like. Then we'll go ahead and actually implement it and talk about all of the details throughout the video. But if we do scroll down to usage, you can see that we are rendering a modal component. And this is actually something that's going to be provided to us. We're going to import it. We pass in some props talking about whether the modal should be open. We can do stuff when the modal closes. We have access to a lot of nice features. And you'll also notice that right inside of the modal, between the opening and closing tags, we have the content for the modal itself. So this is exactly what we set up with the layout component in the last video. This time around though, instead of layout, which we wrote, it'll be modal, which we did not write. So let's go ahead and kick things off by actually installing this into our project. Then we'll figure out how we can import it and use it. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to shut things down and clear the terminal output. And we'll use yarn add to add the most recent version, React Modal. And that would be at 2.2.2. 2.2.2, let's go ahead and install that one. And once it's installed, we'll actually use it. Now, after it installs, we do want to rerun our build. I'm going to rerun yarn run dev server. Then I'll switch over to the browser, pulling up our application, and I'll switch over to our application code. We currently don't have a good place to put the modal code. We're going to be writing some code. We're going to be using this component, and we need the data from Indecision app. Now, we could put it right inside of render, but we already know that's not the best idea. Instead, we should have other components concerned with the presentation, and we'll let Indecision app focus on the data. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're just going to make a single new component in this video, and we'll call this one option modal.js. And right inside of here, we're going to kick things off by getting the necessary imports. First up, we do need React. So we'll import React from React. Now we also need something from Modal, but we're not sure what. Is it a default export? Is it a named export or exports? If so, what are their names? This can be a tricky thing to track down because the docs aren't always the best, but I always recommend going over to the docs page, try to find a nice long one like this guy, because you'll notice that they're not going to show the import statement everywhere. And then I just use the browser's search feature to search for import. And right here, we get something useful. So you can usually get to the right place and you can figure out exactly the syntax we want to use. So here it's a default export called modal. I'll set up the same thing, import modal from React Modal. So it's always kind of a guessing game, but the docs should get you in the right direction. Now we can create our actual component. It's going to be a stateless functional component. It does not need to manage state. Const option modal. We'll set it equal to an arrow function, and then we'll go ahead and export that arrow function. Export default option modal. Now, option modal is going to render that modal, but for now, we can just return some regular old JSX, a div, and inside of there, we'll just put some text. Just a quick sanity check to make sure everything is getting wired up correctly. Now, you might have noticed something about the stateless functional components we've been creating. They're arrow functions, and all we do inside of there is just return something, which means that we can actually use the shorthand syntax for these as well. So what do I want to return? I want to return this stuff, so let's cut it out. Let's remove the curly braces, as well as the return keyword, and just paste it in. Now we have the exact same functionality, we just have it in a way that's a little more concise. There's no need to return, there's no need for the function body. We can just use the implicit return like this. Now let's go ahead and actually import this and render it. Over in Indecision app, we are going to render it down below, but first let's import it. Import option modal from the file that we literally just created. It's in the same directory as this one, so // option modal. Now let's go ahead and render it, and if it shows up correctly, we'll start focusing on actually using the modal component right here. We are going to create an instance of option modal, and there is no need to pass any children in, so we can go ahead and use the self-closing syntax. I save indecision app, I save the other file, and over inside of the browser, we do get some text. So we at least know that option modal is rendering correctly. Now let's focus on actually setting up a modal that hides and shows based off of some values. We can go ahead and remove the div completely, and we're going to start this one off with an instance of modal. We are going to have a separate opening and closing tag because we want to put the modal content right inside. Now, some of the things are going to get passed down as props, so for now we'll focus on the one static thing, which is going to be the title. I'll set this up in an H3, and the title itself will be selected option. And the option text, as well as the button to close it, will come below, and we'll focus on that in just a little bit. Now, this is not a valid use of React Modal. The modal component does require 2 props in order to work, so we want to make sure to pass those in. The first one is open. This lets us determine whether or not the modal should be open. It's going to get set equal to a Boolean, so for example, I could set it to true. The other one that we have to pass in is called content label, and this is used for accessibility purposes. So you just want to come up with a good name for this modal for people using accessible devices, and for us that could just be the same as the title, selected option. This text is not going to show up in the browser. It's only going to show up for users with accessibility settings enabled. Now that we have this in place, we have a completely valid usage of the modal component. Is it real world just yet? Nope, but it is indeed going to render to the browser. Over here, we get our modal showing up. Now, obviously, it looks terrible, and there's actually no way to close it. I can try to click the background or hit the escape key, but there's no way to get out of this. But at least it is showing up. Now, if we wanted to hide the modal, what would we do? We would just set this equal to false. That's going to cause the modal to not show up, and it's never going to show up because we're using the static false here. So instead of using the static true or false, we want to get access to a prop via props. We're going to use that prop value to determine whether or not the modal should open. That means that up above in indecision app, we want to keep track of one new piece of state. Currently, indecision app just tracks the total list of options. We're also going to have it track the selected option. The selected option is going to start off as undefined. When the user first visits the app, there's no reason to show them a modal right away. We're going to set it later when they actually click the "What should I do?" button. So by default, it will be undefined, and we can actually go ahead and pass this down into option modal right here. We're going to pass it in as the selected option prop, and we'll set it equal to right here, this dot state dot selected option. Now that we have it passed in, we can actually save indecision app.js, and we can save option modal after using the prop. So instead of false, it will be props dot selected option. Now, selected option is going to either be undefined or a string, and we can convert that over to true Booleans by using 2 exclamation marks. Now, when I say true Booleans, I don't mean the Boolean true. I mean real Boolean values as opposed to things like undefined, which is not a Boolean, or a string with some text, which is not a Boolean. We'll be using the same technique we explored previously, where we flip it twice. That converts a valid string over to true, and it converts undefined over to false. So we're going to have real Boolean values passed in to isOpen. Now, if I save the program at its current point in time, what's going to happen? The application is going to show up, but there is no way to ever set selected option. So even if I do click this button, you can see the alert fires, but nothing else happens. What we want to do, instead of firing the alert right here, is we want to set the state. This is what we're going to do right here instead of alert. So let's go ahead and remove the alert call and use this dot set state instead. That's actually going to be your challenge. So right here, use set state to set selected option, and we have the value we want to use for selected option right up above. Now you can test your work by saving this file. Make sure you have an item over inside of the browser, and you should be able to click what should I do, and the modal should appear. You're not going to have a way to close the modal, and the text won't even show up inside, but going from undefined to a string will result in the modal is open prop going from false to true. So take some time to knock that one out. All you got to do is add a set state call, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this one out. We're going to be calling this dot set state. We're going to pass in our updater function. Now, do we need access to the previous state? No, we're just overriding a value. We don't care what its old value was, so I don't need to name that argument. And right here, I'm just going to implicitly return an object. And on this object, we just want to set selected option. Now remember, this is the updater object, so just because we leave off options doesn't mean it's getting wiped. It's just not getting changed at all. We want to set selected option equal to whatever is stored in the option variable above. And that's all we have to do. Now we can save Indecision app and we can test our work. The browser refreshes, I have an item, I click what should I do, and the modal shows up. Now, as I mentioned, there is no way to close it, and the text doesn't even appear inside of there, but we'll worry about that in a little bit. The goal for the moment was to just get the modal showing up in a dynamic way. Let's go ahead and continue on by actually showing the text. We're going to put that right here. We can use a little bit of conditional rendering to render the paragraph tag when there's actually a value for a selected option. So we could set that up using the logical AND operator. We will check if props.selectedOption is truthy or not. If it is, we'll go ahead and render the paragraph right here, the p tag, and we will toss inside of that p tag just the text. Props.selectedOption. Excellent. So now not only will the modal open up, it'll actually show the value. So if I click it again, there we have it. We get selected option static, we get test, which is dynamic. Now what we really need to focus on is the ability to close the modal. And we know that we're going to do that with the button. There's a button over here. OK. OK just closes the modal. So how exactly are we going to close the modal? Well, we are going to need a button, so we'll start there. We'll set up the button text to be OK, although you could use anything in the entire world. And now the goal is to figure out how we can clear the selected option state when this button gets clicked. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that by defining a new event handler up here in Indecision app. That one is going to be clearing selected option, much like handle delete options clears the options array. We're then going to pass that down into option modal, much like we pass down the handle delete options prop right here. Then on click, we'll be able to call that prop, and the end result will be the selected option state getting erased. And when the state gets erased, it will re-render the modal, and the modal will go away. So that's actually going to be your challenge for the video. I'll outline those steps right here, and then I'll leave you to it. First up, you are going to create a new event handler in Indecision app that clears the selected option state. So when that function runs, all it needs to do is wipe the state, setting it back equal to undefined. Then you're going to go ahead and pass that into the current component, which is option modal, and you will call it on the button click. So when the modal opens, we'll be able to click that button, and clicking the button should cause the modal to close because we're going to be clearing selected option, which will result in this being false. Take some time to knock that one out and test your work. Try to actually open the modal, click that button, and make sure it does indeed close. When you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, let's get to it. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off by creating the new handler over here in Indecision app. We can put that wherever we like. I'm just going to toss it right here. If you put it somewhere else, that's fine. So we can call this one handle, and I'm going to stick with handle clear selected option. Does this one need to take any arguments? Nope, it just needs to run. So we can leave the arguments list empty. We'll set up our arrow. We'll set up our function body. Perfect. Now we can actually call this dot set state, and we're going to go ahead and clear the selected option state. I'm going to call it, passing in the updater function. We do not need access to the previous state. We already know the value we want to use. It's undefined. I'm going to implicitly return the object just like I do up above. I'm just going to clear the value. So selected option, setting it equal to the default value, which is undefined. So now that the handler is all set up, we can actually pass that down into option modal. I'm going to do that right here. We can call it exactly the same thing, handle clear selected option, setting it equal to the thing we just defined, this dot handle clear selected option. Now that component has access to this as a prop. It can call it when it needs to. When does it need to call it? It needs to call it when the button gets clicked. So on click, what we're going to do is reference props dot handle clear selected option, and that is going to cause the function to actually fire when the button gets clicked. That should clear the state, which should cause the modal to go away. I'm going to remove the comments at the bottom of the file, save things, and we're going to test it out. So I will add in a few other options, and I'll go ahead and click what should I do. Here we got our selected option. The first one was picked, the number 1, and we have our OK button. When I click it, what happens? The modal goes away, which is fantastic. We now have a complete modal setup. We can show the modal when we want to. We can show dynamic content inside of it. And when the user is done with the modal, they have an option to clear it out. Now, aside from just these two props, there are quite a few other props that the modal component supports. One that we're going to look at is called on request close. On request close takes a function, and it calls that function when the user tries to close the modal. When they try to close the modal via the escape key, which I'm hitting right now, or via clicking the background, which is what I'm doing. Now, if you don't set up a handler for on request close, hitting the escape key and clicking the background aren't going to do anything. But we can set up this function to be that handler. And then when someone clicks the background or uses the escape key, the modal will go away. So we'll just set this one equal to props dot handle clear selected option, which is exactly what we just used down below. Now, if I save the option modal, we can bring it up once again by clicking what should I do. Here we're getting 2 as the selected option, and I can click the background and the modal goes away. The same thing is true if the modal is open and I hit the escape key, the modal disappears. And this is fantastic. It's just a little better of a user experience. Now, aside from these two, there are some other ones that we're going to be using specifically when we start styling our application. It's going to allow us to transition the modal, but for now, we have a completely working example. It's not the prettiest thing in the world. We just haven't gotten to that part of the course just yet, but for now, it is completely functional. That's it for this video. We've installed and used our very first third-party component. Now, the other project that we're going to be creating together is going to be much more complex, which means that we're going to be taking advantage of more third-party code. And the great thing about third-party code is that we don't have to rebuild the wheel for things that a lot of applications need. That's why we use libraries like React, Babel, Webpack, and in this case, libraries that just expose React components like a modal component. This is a very common thing. A lot of apps need it. There's no need to rewrite your own. Just grab an open source library, integrate it to your code, and move on to more important things that are specific to your application. There's no need to worry about generic stuff that every app really needs. That's it for this section. In the next one, you're actually going to style indecision, and that's going to be the last section where we work with this app. So you're going to take it from looking like this to looking like this. Stay tuned. I'll see you then.